Sometimes the strongest hearts come wrapped in the most vulnerable packages. When pride is all you have left, asking for help becomes the hardest thing in the world. Cassie Rowe stands at the gates of Thorn Hollow Ranch with nothing but dust on her clothes and hunger in her eyes. She looks up at Garrett Thorne, the wealthy cattleman, and says, "Any work for a meal, mister?" He's ready to turn her away until he sees her hands. Weathered and calloused, they tell stories of hard work and harder times. Something stirs in his chest. He gives her a job for one day, but she stays longer. Her past catches up with her, a dangerous man, and a bounty on her head. Now Garrett must choose between his safe life and protecting the woman who changed everything. Would a man risk it all for someone who came with nothing but courage? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust settled around Cassie's worn boots as she followed Garrett Thorne through the weathered gate of Thorn Hollow Ranch. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling property, revealing a world that seemed carved from the very heart of the American West. Weathered barns stood like sentinels against the horizon, their red paint faded to a rustic burgundy that spoke of decades weathering prairie storms. The main house, a two-story structure with a wraparound porch, commanded respect without ostentation, built by hands that understood the land's demands. Garrett walked with the measured stride of a man who'd covered this ground 1,000 times before. His weathered Stetson sat at just the right angle, casting shadows that couldn't quite hide the lines around his eyes, lines earned from squinting into countless sunrises and bearing burdens that came with 3,000 acres of responsibility. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd learned that respect was earned through action, not words. "Stables are this way," he said, his voice carrying the gravelly warmth of a man who spent more time talking to horses than people. "You'll start with mucking stalls. $1 an hour, plus meals. Work runs from sunup to sundown." Cassie nodded, clutching her battered leather satchel closer to her chest. The bag had seen better years, its brown surface scarred by weather and wear, buckles tarnished, and leather softened by countless miles. Yet she held it with the tenderness of someone protecting something precious, or perhaps protecting herself from losing what little remained. "That's more than fair, sir," she replied, her voice carrying traces of somewhere else perhaps, Texas, maybe Oklahoma, but softened by recent hardship. "I'm grateful for the chance." The stables rose before them, a testament to prosperity and care. 20 stalls lined the interior, each one meticulously maintained with fresh straw and gleaming water troughs. The scent of hay and horse filled the air, mixed with the earthy smell of well-tended livestock. Sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the golden beams. "These are my pride," Garrett said, gesturing toward the horses. Quarter horses, mostly. Some Arabian bloodlines mixed in for speed and endurance. Every one of them knows their job, and they expect the same from anyone who works around them. A magnificent black stallion approached the gate of his stall, ears pricked forward with intelligent curiosity. Cassie instinctively extended her hand, palm up, allowing the horse to catch her scent. The stallion's nostrils flared delicately, and after a moment's consideration, he allowed her to stroke his muzzle. "That's Thunder," Garrett said, watching the interaction with keen interest. "He's particular about who he trusts. Took 3 months before he'd let my last stable hand get close enough to brush him properly." "He's beautiful," Cassie murmured, her voice taking on a different quality, softer, more reverent. "You can see the intelligence in his eyes, the nobility." Something flickered across Garrett's face, a recognition of something deeper than casual admiration. Most drifters looking for work would have nodded politely and moved on. This woman understood horses in a way that couldn't be taught. "You've worked with horses before," he observed, not quite a question. "Some," she replied, her hand still gentle on Thunder's neck. "My father had a small spread when I was growing up. Nothing like this, but enough to teach me that horses remember kindness, and they remember cruelty even longer." The mention of her father brought a shadow across her features, brief but unmistakable. Garrett filed the observation away, his instincts sharpened by years of reading both horses and men. Everyone who wandered onto his property carried stories, but most were straightforward tales of hard luck and harder choices. This woman's story felt different, deeper, more carefully guarded. "Well then," he said, pulling his grandfather's pocket watch from his vest with practiced ease. The gold had worn smooth from decades of handling, first by his grandfather, then his father, and now by him. The weight of it in his palm carried more than time, it carried legacy, responsibility, the accumulated wisdom of generations who'd worked this land. "It's 7:30. Breakfast is at 8, served in the main house kitchen. After that, you'll start with the stalls on the east side." The kitchen windows glowed warmly in the morning light as they approached the main house. Through the glass, Cassie could see a spacious room with white cabinets, a large wooden table worn smooth by use, and copper pots hanging from hooks above a massive stove. The domestic scene stirred something in her chest, a longing for normalcy she'd almost forgotten existed. "Maria Santos runs the kitchen," Garrett explained, opening the back door. "She's been with the ranch for 15 years, and she rules that domain with an iron skillet. Stay on her good side, and you'll eat better than most folks in town." Maria emerged from the pantry as they entered, a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. She wore a flour-dusted apron over a simple blue dress, and her hands moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd prepared thousands of meals for working men. "Quien es esta?" she asked, looking Cassie up and down with the assessing gaze of someone who'd sized up her share of drifters and temporary help. "New hand," Garrett replied in Spanish, that carried the easy fluency of someone who'd grown up hearing it daily. "Cassie Rowe. She'll be working the stables." Maria's expression softened marginally as she took in Cassie's worn clothes and the careful way she held herself, not with the swagger of someone looking for easy work, but with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that work was a privilege, not a right. "Bienvenida," she said simply, then switched to English. "You look hungry, mija. Sit. I'll fix you something proper." The kindness in her voice nearly undid Cassie's careful composure. She blinked rapidly, settling into a chair at the worn wooden table with the careful movements of someone who'd learned not to take comfort for granted. "Just coffee would be fine, ma'am," Cassie said. "I don't want to be any trouble." Maria made a dismissive sound and began pulling ingredients from the pantry. "Trouble is letting good people go hungry when there's plenty to share. You eat, you work better. You work better, everyone benefits." As Maria worked, the kitchen filled with the sounds and smells of breakfast preparation. Bacon sizzled in a heavy iron skillet, eggs cracked into a bowl with practiced efficiency, and bread emerged from the oven with a golden crust that spoke of years perfecting the recipe. The normalcy of it all created a warmth in Cassie's chest that felt dangerous, too much like hope. Garrett poured coffee from a pot that had been keeping warm on the stove, the dark liquid steaming in heavy ceramic mugs. He settled across from Cassie, close enough to study her without seeming obvious about it. In the better light of the kitchen, he could see more clearly the story her appearance told. Her clothes were worn but clean, mended with careful stitches that spoke of pride, despite circumstances. Her hair, though dusty from travel, had been braided with care. Most telling were her hands, not just weathered from work, but marked with specific calluses that came from handling rope, leather, and tools. "How long since you've eaten?" he asked quietly. "Yesterday," she replied, then added quickly, "I'm fine. I've gone longer." The casual way she said "itas," if going without food, was as natural as commenting on the weather stirred something protective in Garrett's chest. He'd seen plenty of hard luck cases, but there was something about this woman that got under his skin in a way he couldn't quite name. Maria set a plate before Cassie that could have fed 2 working men. Eggs over easy, thick slices of bacon, hash browns golden and crispy, and 2 biscuits that steamed when broken open. The woman's eyes widened at the generosity, and for a moment emotion threatened to overwhelm her composure. I can't possibly. You can and you will, Maria said firmly. A woman your size needs proper food to do proper work. Eat. The first bite seemed to break something loose in Cassie, and she ate with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste anything. Between bites, she glanced around the kitchen, taking in the details that spoke of a home rather than just a house. Photographs on the windowsill showing ranch life through the years, a collection of blue pottery that caught the morning light, herbs growing in small pots on the counter. Beautiful place, she said between careful bites. You've built something special here. Wasn't me, Garrett replied, following her gaze. My grandfather started this ranch in 1892. My father expanded it. I'm just trying not to mess up what they built. The humility in his voice surprised her. Most men with his obvious wealth and success would have claimed credit for everything in sight. Instead, he spoke of his role as temporary stewardship, understanding that he was part of something larger than himself. That's wisdom, she said quietly, understanding that we're all just passing through, trying to leave things better than we found them. The philosophical observation hung in the air between them, revealing depths that went beyond the simple transaction of work for food. Garrett studied her face, seeing intelligence and experience that didn't match her desperate circumstances. What brought you to Bridal's End? He asked carefully. Her fork paused, midway to her mouth, and something shuttered behind her eyes. Just traveling through, looking for work where I can find it. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Garrett had spent enough time reading people to recognize the careful editing of someone who'd learned that honesty could be dangerous. Well, he said, letting the subject drop for now, you've found work here, as long as you need it. The simple statement carried more weight than its surface meaning, and Cassie felt tears prick her eyes. Kindness had become so rare in her world that she'd almost forgotten how to receive it. Thank you, she said, the words carrying the weight of genuine gratitude. The kitchen door opened, and two men entered with the easy familiarity of people who belonged. The first was a weathered man in his 60s, with silver hair and the bow-legged gait of someone who'd spent his life on horseback. The second was younger, perhaps 30, with the lean build and quick eyes of someone who'd learned early that survival meant staying alert. Morning, boss, the older man said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Heard we got some new help. Cassie Rowe, Garrett said. Meet Jake Morrison, my foreman, and Tommy Santos, Maria's boy and our best hand with the horses. Jake nodded politely, his assessment quick but not unkind. Tommy offered a shy smile and a quiet ma'am that spoke of good upbringing. Cassie's going to start with the stables, Garrett continued. She knows her way around horses. Good, Jake said, settling into his chair as Maria automatically began preparing plates for the men. We can use the help. Spring roundup's coming, and there's always more work than hands to do it. The conversation flowed around normal ranch business, which pastures needed attention, repairs that couldn't wait, the weather forecast that might affect their plans. Cassie listened quietly, learning the rhythms of this place, the way these people worked together with the ease of a well-oiled machine. As the meal wound down, Garrett stood and checked his pocket watch again. The morning routine was as familiar as breathing breakfast, assignments, the start of another day, maintaining the careful balance that kept 3,000 acres running smoothly. Ready to get started? He asked Cassie. She nodded, rising from the table with renewed energy. The food had done more than fill her empty stomach. It had reminded her that there were still places in the world where people treated each other with basic decency. The morning sun climbed higher as they walked back toward the stables, painting the ranch in shades of gold and amber. Cassie breathed deeply, tasting the clean air that carried hints of grass, leather, and that indefinable scent of wide-open spaces. It's peaceful here, she said, almost to herself. It is, Garrett agreed. Took me a while to appreciate it properly. When I was younger, I thought I needed to prove myself in the wider world. Spent some time in Denver, even made it to Chicago once, but this place calls you back. It gets into your blood. They reached the stables, and Garrett began showing her the layout, the routines, the particular needs of each horse. His hands moved with practiced competence as he demonstrated the proper way to muck a stall, how to check water levels, the signs that indicated a horse might be off its feed. "The work's not glamorous," he said, "but it's honest, and the horses appreciate consistency. They like knowing what to expect." Cassie nodded, understanding immediately. Consistency was a luxury she'd been denied for too long, but perhaps here, for however long it lasted, she could find something approaching normal. As Garrett handed her a pitchfork and showed her to the first stall, neither of them could have predicted that this simple beginning would set in motion events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about safety, trust, and the courage required to build something lasting in a world that often seemed designed to tear things down. The pocket watch in Garrett's vest ticked steadily, marking the passage of time in a place where time moved differently than in the rushing world beyond the ranch gates. Here, time was measured in the completion of necessary tasks, the changing of seasons, the slow building of trust between creatures who had learned that survival meant being careful about whom to trust. And in that measured time, something began to grow that neither of them was quite ready to name. 3 days into her work at Thorn Hollow, Cassie had fallen into a rhythm that felt almost like belonging. The horses knew her step now, and Thunder had taken to nickering softly whenever she approached his stall. The simple routine of mucking, feeding, and grooming provided a structure her life had lacked for months. She was careful not to let herself feel too settled, but the temptation grew stronger each morning when Maria handed her a steaming cup of coffee and asked about her plans for the day. It was Thursday morning when the photograph fell from her satchel. She'd been reaching for the small sewing kit she kept wrapped in oilcloth, intending to mend a tear in her work shirt during the lunch break. The movement jostled the bag's contents, and a folded piece of paper fluttered to the stable floor like a wounded bird. Cassie's heart stopped. The photograph was creased and torn along one edge, the image faded from handling and time. But the faces were still clear enough to tell their story. A younger Cassie, standing beside a weathered man with kind eyes and work, roughened hands, both of them squinting into bright sunlight in front of a modest farmhouse. Behind them, a small herd of cattle grazed in a pasture that stretched toward distant hills. What made her blood run cold wasn't the photograph itself, but the third figure visible at the edge of the framer, man whose face had been deliberately scratched out with what looked like a knife blade, leaving only a dark, jagged scar across the paper where his features should have been. "Cassie?" She spun toward the voice, her hand instinctively reaching to cover the photograph. Garrett stood in the stable doorway, his expression shifting from casual greeting to concern as he took in her pale face and rigid posture. "Everything all right?" "Fine," she said quickly, too quickly. She bent to retrieve the photograph, but her hands shook as she folded it and shoved it back into her satchel. "Just dropped something." Garrett's practiced eye caught the tremor in her movements, the way her breathing had changed from steady to shallow. In his years of working with spooked horses, he'd learned to recognize the signs of an animal pushed past its comfort zone, and Cassie showed every indication of someone fighting the urge to bolt. "You sure about that?" he asked gently, stepping into the stable but keeping his distance. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The kindness in his voice nearly broke her resolve. For 3 days, she'd been surrounded by normalcy, by people who treated her with basic human decency. The contrast with her recent experiences had lowered her guard in ways she couldn't afford. "I'm fine," she repeated, but her voice cracked on the words. Garrett studied her face, noting the way her eyes darted toward the stable entrance as if calculating escape routes. Whatever she'd dropped had triggered a fear response that went bone deep. He'd seen enough trauma in his time, both in animals and people, to recognize when someone was balancing on the edge of flight. "Cassie," he said quietly, "I don't know what's got you spooked, but you're safe here. Whatever it is, we can talk about it." The simple declaration hit her like a physical blow. Safe. When had she last felt truly safe? When had she last been in a place where someone offered to listen without demanding payment or leverage in return? "You don't understand," she whispered, clutching her satchel against her chest like armor. "I shouldn't have stayed this long. I should have kept moving." Stayed where? Kept moving from what? The questions hung in the air between them, and Cassie felt the careful walls she'd built around her story beginning to crack. The photograph burned in her satchel like a live coal, a reminder of everything she'd lost and everything that still threatened what little remained. "There's a man," she said finally, the words coming out in a rush. "He claims I belong to him, that I'm his property because of debts my father supposedly owed. He's been following me for months, and he won't stop until—" She cut herself off, unable to voice the rest. The things Dutch Kellerman had promised to do when he caught her were the stuff of nightmares, spoken in a voice that made even hardened ranch hands step carefully around him. "What kind of man?" Garrett's voice had taken on a different quality, harder, more focused. "His name is Dutch Kellerman. He was foreman on a spread outside Amarillo. My father worked for him before." She stopped again, the words catching in her throat. "Before what, Cassie?" "Before he died." The words came out flat, emotionless. "There was an accident. At least, that's what Dutch called it. But my father was careful around machinery. He'd been working with equipment since he was a boy." Garrett felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd heard stories about men like Dutch Kellerman, who used their positions to control and exploit others, who saw people as property to be owned rather than human beings deserving of respect. "This debt he claims your father owed." "Gambling debts," he said. "Money my father never had to gamble with." Cassie's voice gained strength as anger began to override fear. "My father was many things, but he wasn't a gambler. He worked hard, saved every penny, and never spent money we didn't have. So when your father died, this Dutch decided you were responsible for the debt. He said I could work it off. Said I belonged to him now, that the law wouldn't help a woman with no family and no proof of what really happened." Her hands clenched into fists. "He made it clear that the work he had in mind wasn't the kind that paid wages." The picture became clearer and uglier with each detail. Garrett had encountered men like Dutch before, predators who used positions of authority to trap vulnerable people in webs of false debt and manufactured obligation. The fact that Cassie had managed to escape spoke to a strength and resourcefulness that impressed him, even as it broke his heart. "How long have you been running?" 4 months. She sagged against Thunder's stall, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "I thought I'd lost him in Kansas, but then I heard he was asking questions in the towns behind me. He's persistent." "And you think he's close now?" Cassie nodded miserably. "Yesterday, when Tommy went to town for supplies, he mentioned a man asking about me. Description matched Dutch perfectly. The revelation explained her jumpiness over the past day, the way she'd kept glancing toward the road whenever she heard hoofbeats or wagon wheels. She'd been preparing to run again, to leave behind the first place in months that had offered her sanctuary. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because good people shouldn't have to pay for other people's troubles," she said simply. "You've been kind to me, kinder than I deserved. I won't bring danger to your door because of my problems." The quiet dignity in her response stirred something protective in Garrett's chest. Here was a woman who'd been through hell, who had every reason to become bitter and grasping, yet she worried about bringing trouble to people who'd shown her kindness. "That's not your choice to make," he said firmly. "This is my ranch, my door, and my decision about what dangers I'm willing to face. You don't know what he's like." "I know what you're like," Garrett interrupted. "I know you've worked harder in 3 days than some hands do in a week. I know you gentle my horses with a touch that speaks of natural understanding. I know you worry about being a burden, even when you're pulling your own weight and then some." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to the gentle tone he used with spooked animals. "I also know that no man has the right to claim ownership over another human being, no matter what papers he waves or what lies he tells." Cassie stared at him, seeing something in his eyes that she'd almost forgotten existed, the kind of man who stood by his principles even when it cost him something. Her father had been that kind of man, and it had gotten him killed. He's dangerous, Garrett. He has men who work for him, men who don't ask questions about what they're told to do. If he comes here, then we'll deal with it." The certainty in his voice left no room for argument. "This ranch has weathered storms before. We'll weather this one too." "Why?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why would you risk everything for someone you barely know?" Garrett was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. The truth was complicated, part protective instinct, part recognition of something in her that called to him, part simple human decency that couldn't stand by while someone suffered. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally, "and because my father raised me to believe that how we treat people when they're at their weakest says more about our character than anything we do when times are easy." The simple honesty of his response broke something loose in Cassie's chest, and tears she'd been holding back for months finally spilled over. She pressed her hands to her face, shoulders shaking with the force of emotions too long suppressed. Garrett wanted to comfort her, to offer the physical reassurance of a gentle touch, but he recognized that she needed space to release the pressure that had been building inside her. Instead, he waited quietly, offering his presence without demanding anything in return. When the tears finally subsided, Cassie wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and lingering fear. "He won't just go away," she said. "Dutch doesn't give up on things he considers his property. Then we need to be ready for him." Garrett's voice carried the calm authority of a man who'd faced his share of troubles and come through them intact. "First thing tomorrow, I'll ride to town and have a talk with Sheriff Harrison. Dutch Kellerman might have had his way in Texas, but this is Colorado, and we do things different here. What if the law won't help? What if he has connections or money to buy cooperation? Then we handle it ourselves." The statement was matter of fact, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never backed down from a fight when the cause was just. "This ranch has good people who understand the difference between right and wrong. Whatever Dutch Kellerman thinks he's going to do here, he'll find that Colorado hospitality has its limits." For the first time in months, Cassie felt a flicker of hope kindle in her chest. It was fragile, easily extinguished, but it was there, the possibility that she might not have to keep running, that she might have found people willing to stand with her against the darkness that had been chasing her. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You don't need to thank me," Garrett replied. "You just need to trust me. Can you do that?" Cassie looked into his eyes, seeing strength tempered by compassion, determination balanced by wisdom. In her father, she'd learned to recognize the kind of man who kept his word, even when it cost him everything. Garrett Thorne was cut from the same cloth. "Yes," she said simply, "I can trust you." The photograph in her satchel seemed less dangerous now, its torn edges representing not just loss and threat, but also the possibility that some stories could have different endings than the ones that seemed inevitable. Outside the stable, thunder nickered softly, as if sensing that something important had shifted in the small world of Thorn Hollow Ranch. The worn leather satchel sat on Cassie's narrow cot like a sleeping serpent, its presence both familiar and threatening in the small room above the stable that Garrett had offered her. She'd spent the last hour staring at it, knowing that inside lay not just her meager possessions, but the remnants of a life that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Friday morning brought crisp air and the promise of another day's honest work, but Cassie found herself moving through the familiar routines with heightened awareness. Every sound beyond the stable walls, the creak of wagon wheels, the distant lowing of cattle, the conversations of ranch hands going about their business, carried the potential for danger. She was brushing Thunder's midnight coat when Garrett appeared, leading a chestnut mare with gentle eyes and a patient disposition. "Thought you might like to meet Honey," he said, stroking the mare's neck with practiced affection. "She's getting on in years, but she's still the smartest horse on the ranch. Knows these trails better than most of the men who ride them." Cassie approached slowly, extending her hand for the mare to investigate. Honey's soft muzzle explored her palm with delicate curiosity before allowing her head to be stroked. "She's beautiful," Cassie said, meaning it. How old? 18 this spring. My father bought her as a yearling, said she had the look of a horse that would remember kindness and repay it tenfold. He was right. There was something in his tone that suggested deeper meaning, and Cassie found herself studying his profile as he worked. The morning light revealed details she'd been too distracted to notice before: the small scar along his jawline, the way his hands moved with unconscious competence, the patience in his movements that spoke of a man who understood that the best things in life couldn't be rushed. Your father sounds like he was a wise man. He was. Garrett's voice carried the weight of loss tempered by good memories. He always said that how a person treats animals tells you everything you need to know about their character. Animals can't lie or pretend they respond to what's really there. The observation hung in the air between them, and Cassie wondered what her interactions with the horses revealed about her own character. In the past months of running and hiding, she'd sometimes felt as if she'd lost track of who she really was, beneath the layers of fear and desperation. What did he think horses could see in people? Garrett considered the question as he checked Honey's hooves with practiced efficiency. Authenticity, mostly. Horses know when someone's genuine and when they're putting on an act. They respond to calm confidence, but they can spot false bravado from a mile away. They trust people who are comfortable with themselves. And what do you think your horses see in me? The question surprised him with its vulnerability. He looked up from Honey's hoof to find Cassie watching him with an expression that was part curiosity, part fear of the answer. They see someone who's been hurt, but hasn't let it make her cruel, he said after a moment. Someone who's learned to be careful without becoming closed off. Thunder's a good judge of character, and he took to you faster than anyone I've ever seen. The simple honesty of his assessment brought color to her cheeks. It had been so long since someone had spoken of her character in positive terms that she'd almost forgotten she possessed qualities worth noting. Jake mentioned you rode the north pasture fence yesterday. Garrett continued, moving to check the mare's other hooves. Said you spotted 3 places where the wire had come loose and fixed them without being asked. The cattle would have wandered if it wasn't repaired, she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Seemed like the practical thing to do. Most hands would have reported it and let someone else handle the repairs. Most hands probably have other skills that are more valuable to the ranch. I know fence work. Her matter-of-fact response revealed an attitude toward work that impressed him. She didn't seek credit or recognition. She simply saw what needed doing and did it. In a world where too many people looked for shortcuts or ways to avoid responsibility, her approach was refreshing. Where did you learn fence work? The question brought shadows to her eyes, and Garrett mentally kicked himself for pushing into territory that was still too painful to explore freely. My father's place, she said simply. We didn't have money to hire help for everything, so I learned to do whatever needed doing. Fence mending, equipment maintenance, basic veterinary care for the stock. Sounds like you had a good teacher. The best. Her voice softened with memory. He used to say that there was no shame in any honest work, that every job done well was a kind of prayer. He believed that how we tend to our responsibilities reflects how we honor the life we've been given. The philosophy resonated with Garrett's own upbringing, and he found himself wanting to know more about the man who'd raised such a daughter. But he could see that talking about her father brought both comfort and pain, memories too precious and too recent to examine closely. He sounds like someone I would have liked to know. He would have liked you, Cassie said with quiet certainty. He had a gift for recognizing good people, said it came from years of having to judge whether someone could be trusted with his livelihood. They worked in companionable silence for a while, moving through the morning routines with the easy coordination of people who understood the rhythm of ranch life. Cassie found herself relaxing into the familiar tasks, her body remembering skills and movements that connected her to better times. It was Tommy Santos who brought the first ripple of unease to the morning's peace. "Boss," he called from the stable entrance, his young voice carrying a note of concern. "Jake wants to see you up at the house. Says it's important." Garrett glanced at Cassie, noting the way her shoulders tensed at the interruption. Any break in routine had become a source of anxiety for her, a reminder that the peace she'd found here was fragile. "Keep working," he told her gently. "I'll be back shortly." But as he walked toward the main house, Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that Tommy's message carried more weight than the boy's casual delivery suggested. Jake Morrison wasn't prone to unnecessary drama, and anything that prompted him to request a meeting usually meant trouble was brewing. He found Jake waiting on the front porch, his weathered face set in the grim lines that appeared when ranch business took a turn toward the complicated. Maria stood beside him, her usually warm expression clouded with worry. "What's going on?" Garrett asked without preamble. "Had a visitor this morning," Jake said, settling into one of the porch chairs with the careful movements of a man whose joints had absorbed their share of hard living. "Fellow came by just after dawn, asking questions about a woman who might have come through looking for work." Garrett felt ice form in his stomach. "Description?" "Tall, thin brown hair. Said she'd be traveling alone, probably on foot. Claimed to be looking for his wife. Said she'd run off after some kind of misunderstanding." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing useful," Jake replied with satisfaction. "Told him we hadn't seen anyone matching that description. Suggested he try the ranches closer to town." "Good man." Garrett's mind was already racing ahead, considering options and preparations. "What did he look like?" "Big fellow, maybe 45, 50 years old. Had the look of someone used to getting his way. Rode a good horse. Carried himself like a man with authority. But there was something about his eyes." Jake paused, searching for the right words. "Cold. Like looking at a snake." Maria spoke up for the first time. "I watched from the kitchen window. That man, he has the look of someone who hurts people. I've seen it before." Her assessment carried weight. Maria had grown up in a hard part of Texas before coming to work for the Thorns, and her ability to read character had been sharpened by necessity. "Any idea which direction he went when he left?" "East, toward the Morrison place," Jake said. "But I got the feeling he wasn't done with this area. Man like that, he doesn't give up easy." Garrett leaned against the porch railing, considering their options. Dutch Kellermanand, he was certain that's who their visitor had been, was clearly following Cassie's trail with systematic determination. The fact that he'd reached Thorn Hollow meant that staying ahead of him would require more than simple geography. "Jake, I want you to spread the word among the hands. Anyone asks about Cassie, they haven't seen her. Anyone they don't recognize asking questions about anything, they're to report it immediately. You want to tell me what this is really about?" Garrett looked at his foreman, a man who'd been with the ranch for over a decade and had earned the right to know when trouble was heading their way. "Cassie's running from a man who claims she belongs to him. Says her father owed gambling debts, that she's his property now. From what she's told me, the man's dangerous and doesn't take no for an answer." Jake's expression darkened. One of those types. Figured it might be something like that, the way she startles at sudden noises and watches the roads. "What do you think?" "I think a man who claims ownership over another human being needs to be educated about the error of his ways," Jake said with the quiet certainty of someone who'd faced down his share of bullies. "And I think this ranch has enough good men to provide that education if it becomes necessary." The loyalty in his foreman's voice warmed Garrett's chest. Jake Morrison had seen enough of the world to recognize evil when it presented itself, and his willingness to stand against it was both comforting and necessary. "I hope it doesn't come to that, but I'm glad to know you feel that way." "Boss," Jake said, his tone becoming more serious, "that girl's been working harder than anyone has a right to expect, and she's never asked for anything but the chance to earn her keep. That counts for something in my book. Mine too. What's our next move?" Garrett considered their options. Dutch Kellerman knew Cassie was in the area, which meant running would only delay the inevitable confrontation. Better to face the problem on ground they knew, with allies they could trust. "First, I'm riding to town to talk with Sheriff Harrison. This needs to be handled legally if possible. And if it can't be handled legally, then we handle it the way my grandfather would have, with clear conscience and steady aim." The determination in Garrett's voice left no doubt about his commitment to protecting Cassie, whatever the cost. Jake nodded approvingly, recognizing the steel beneath his employer's usually calm demeanor. "I'll make sure the men know what's expected," Jake said, "and I'll have Tommy keep an extra eye on the approaches to the ranch. Boy's got sharp eyes and good instincts." As they talked, Cassie continued her work in the stables, unaware that the shadow she'd been fleeing had finally caught up with her sanctuary. The leather satchel in her room held the torn photograph that had started this conversation, its damaged surface a reminder that some things, once broken, could never be completely repaired. But perhaps, with the right people standing beside her, they could be strong enough to endure whatever storms lay ahead. The hand-carved wooden cross lay warm against Cassie's palm as she sat on the edge of her narrow cot, watching the last light of day fade beyond her small window. The simple piece of pine, worn smooth by years of handling, had been her father's most treasured possession, not because of its monetary value, which was negligible, but because of what it represented. "Faith isn't about having all the answers," he'd told her once, pressing the cross into her young hands during a particularly difficult time when drought had threatened their small herd. "It's about believing that even when we can't see the path forward, we're not walking it alone." She'd carried those words, and the cross, through every challenge since. Even in the darkest moments of the past 4 months, when Dutch Kellerman's pursuit had seemed inescapable, she'd found comfort in the smooth wood and the faith it represented. Now, as shadows gathered around Thorn Hollow Ranch, she found herself clinging to both with renewed urgency. A soft knock on her door interrupted her contemplation. "Cassie? It's Garrett. May I come in?" She slipped the cross beneath her shirt and opened the door to find him standing in the narrow hallway, his hat in his hands, and concern etched in the lines around his eyes. "Of course," she said, stepping back to let him enter the small space. The room was spartanly furnished: a cot, a washstand, a single chair, and a small table beneath the window. Cassie's few possessions were arranged with military precision, everything in its place and ready for quick departure, if necessary. The tidiness spoke of a life lived in constant preparation for flight. Garrett noticed the ready state of her belongings, the way her satchel sat within easy reach of the bed, and felt a pang of sadness for the peace she'd never been able to take for granted. "I wanted to talk to you about this morning's visitor," he said gently. Cassie's face went pale, but she nodded for him to continue. She'd sensed the tension in the air all day, the way conversations stopped when she approached, the careful glances cast in her direction. "Dutch Kellerman was here. Jake turned him away without giving him any information, but he knows you're in the area." The confirmation of her worst fears should have sent her into a panic, but instead, Cassie felt a strange calm settle over her. The waiting was over. Whatever came next, at least she would face it with people who'd chosen to stand beside her. "How long do you think we have?" she asked. "Hard to say. He's checking other ranches, but he'll be back. Men like that don't give up easily." Cassie moved to the window, looking out over the ranch that had become her sanctuary. In the distance, she could see lights beginning to glow in the main house windows, warm and welcoming against the gathering darkness. "I should leave," she said quietly. "Tonight, before he comes back, I won't bring this trouble down on your heads." "No." The word came out more forcefully than Garrett had intended, and he softened his tone. "That's not an option. Running hasn't solved the problem, it's only delayed it. This ends here, one way or another. You don't understand what he's capable of." "Then help me understand." Garrett settled into the single chair, his presence filling the small space with calm authority. "Tell me about your father. Tell me what really happened." Cassie was quiet for a long moment, her fingers unconsciously finding the cross beneath her shirt. The story she'd kept locked inside for months, pressed against her throat like a living thing, demanding release. "My father was Thomas Rowe," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was a good man, an honest man. He worked for Dutch Kellerman's outfit outside Amarillo, managing a section of rangeland that had been poorly maintained before he took it over." She turned from the window, needing to see Garrett's face as she spoke, to gauge whether he would believe what others had dismissed as the desperate lies of a grief-stricken daughter. He turned that section into the most productive grazing land on the entire spread. The cattle thrived, the grass recovered, and Dutch made more money from that section than he'd ever made before. But instead of being grateful, Dutch became suspicious. Suspicious of what? He couldn't believe that an honest man could accomplish so much through simple, hard work. He convinced himself that my father was stealing from him, somehow skimming profits, selling cattle on the side, something to explain the success. Cassie's voice gained strength as she continued, anger beginning to burn through the grief that had paralyzed her for so long. He started making demands. Wanted my father to sign papers, giving him a percentage of any improvements to the land. Wanted documentation of every decision, every expenditure, every head of cattle. He was looking for evidence of theft that didn't exist. And when he couldn't find any, he created it. The words came out bitter as gall. Started claiming that my father owed gambling debts to a card game that met in the bunkhouse. Said he had witnesses who'd seen my father lose money he couldn't afford to lose. Garrett felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. But your father wasn't a gambler. He'd never played cards for money in his life. Said it was a fool's way to lose what he'd worked hard to earn. But Dutch had men who would swear to whatever story he wanted told. And my father was just one man with no political connections and no money for lawyers. The injustice of it stirred something dark in Garrett's chest. He'd seen similar scenarios play out across the West, powerful men, using their influence to exploit and destroy those who couldn't fight back through the system. What happened to him? Cassie's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks as the memory she'd been trying to suppress finally forced its way to the surface. There was an accident with a hay baler. The safety mechanism failed, and he was caught in the machinery. Dutch claimed it was mechanical failure, but I'd seen my father check that equipment myself the day before. He was meticulous about safety, especially with dangerous machinery. You think Dutch sabotaged it? I know he did. Her voice carried absolute certainty. I found scratches on the safety catch where someone had filed it to make it fail. But by the time I could show anyone, Dutch had already had the equipment hauled away and scrapped. The picture was becoming clearer and uglier with each detail. Garrett had encountered men like Dutch Kellerman before, predators who used their positions to destroy anyone who threatened their sense of control. And after your father died, Dutch showed up at the funeral with papers claiming my father owed him $3,000 in gambling debts, said that since I was the only heir, the debt transferred to me, offered to let me work it off in his employ. The euphemistic phrasing couldn't disguise the true nature of Dutch's offer, and Garrett felt his hands clench into fists. The thought of this gentle, hard-working woman being subjected to such degradation made his blood run cold. But you ran instead. I tried to fight it legally first, went to the sheriff, to the judge, to anyone who would listen. But Dutch had money and influence, and I was just a grieving woman with no proof and no resources. They all told me the same thing, honor the debt or face the consequences. So you left. In the middle of the night, with nothing but the clothes on my back and whatever I could carry in my father's old satchel. I thought if I could get far enough away, start over somewhere he couldn't find me, I could build a new life. But he followed you. He hired men to track me, professional bounty hunters who know how to find people who don't want to be found. Every time I thought I'd gotten away, they'd show up asking questions, getting closer. Cassie sank onto the edge of her cot, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. The constant fear, the endless running, the knowledge that she could never truly rest had worn her down to a shadow of the woman she'd been before her father's death. "I'm tired, Garrett," she whispered. "I'm so tired of running, of looking over my shoulder, of never being able to trust that kindness isn't a trap. But I can't stop. If I stop, he wins." Garrett rose from his chair and moved to sit beside her on the narrow cot, careful to maintain appropriate distance while offering his presence as comfort. "You don't have to run anymore," he said quietly. "You've found people who believe in doing what's right, regardless of the cost. That has to count for something. But what if it's not enough? What if he has too much power, too many resources? Then we'll find another way." The certainty in his voice was absolute. My father used to say that evil only triumphs when good people decide it's too difficult to oppose it. I've never believed in backing down from bullies, and I'm not about to start now." Cassie looked into his eyes, seeing the same quality of character that had made her father such a formidable opponent of injustice. The resemblance wasn't physical, but something deeper, a moral courage that refused to compromise with evil, regardless of the personal cost. "Why?" she asked, echoing her question from the stable. "Why risk everything for someone you've known less than a week?" Garrett was quiet for a moment, considering how to put into words the complex mixture of protective instinct, moral conviction, and growing personal attachment that drove his determination to help her. "Because I've seen what happens when good people stand by and do nothing," he said finally. "Because my father taught me that how we treat the vulnerable in our society reflects who we really are as people. And because—" He stopped, suddenly aware that he was about to venture into territory that might be too personal, too soon. "Because what?" "Because you matter," he said simply, "not just as someone deserving of help, but as yourself. In the few days you've been here, you've made this place better. You've brought a kind of peace to the horses, a warmth to the kitchen, a sense of purpose to work that had started to feel routine." The honesty in his words hit her like a physical blow. It had been so long since someone had seen value in her as a person, rather than as property or problem, that she'd almost forgotten such recognition was possible. "I don't know how to be anything other than careful," she whispered. "I don't know how to trust that good things can last." "Then we'll learn together," Garrett said. "One day at a time, one choice at a time, until careful becomes confident and fear becomes faith." The wooden cross seemed to grow warm against her skin, and Cassie found herself remembering her father's words about not walking the path alone. Perhaps faith wasn't just about believing in divine providence. Perhaps it was also about recognizing the divine in human kindness, in the willingness of strangers to become allies, in the courage to hope when hope seemed foolish. "I want to believe that," she said, her voice stronger now. "I want to believe that this can end differently than it started." "It will," Garrett promised. "Whatever Dutch Kellerman thinks he's going to accomplish here, he's about to learn that some things are worth fighting for, and some people won't be intimidated." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drifted through the window. Both of them froze, listening as the rhythm grew closer, more distinct. It was too late for casual visitors, too purposeful for routine ranch business. "Stay here," Garrett said quietly, rising and moving toward the window. But Cassie was already on her feet, her hand instinctively reaching for her satchel. If it's him, we face it together." Garrett's voice carried the calm authority of a man who'd made his decision and would see it through regardless of consequences. "No more running, remember." The hoofbeats stopped in the ranch yard below, followed by the sound of voices, Jake's measured tones, mixing with something harder, more demanding. Even through the closed window, they could hear the tension in the exchange. Cassie moved to stand beside Garrett at the window, and together they looked down into the yard, where lamplight revealed Jake Morrison facing a tall, broad-shouldered man whose posture radiated barely controlled aggression. Even in the uncertain light, there was no mistaking the cold calculation in Dutch Kellerman's stance. "He's not alone," Cassie whispered, noting the two mounted figures who remained in the shadows, just beyond the circle of light. "Neither are we," Garrett replied, his hand moving instinctively to check the revolver at his hip. "Jake can handle himself, and Tommy's probably already alerting the other hands." They watched as the confrontation below continued, Dutch's voice rising with each of Jake's refusals to provide information. The man's frustration was evident in his gestures, the way he moved closer to Jake with each exchange, using his size to intimidate. "He's getting angry," Cassie observed, recognizing the signs that had preceded violence in her past encounters with Dutch. "Good," Garrett said grimly. "Angry men make mistakes." The exchange below reached some kind of conclusion, with Dutch gesturing sharply toward his companions before mounting his horse with movements that spoke of barely contained fury. As the three riders disappeared into the darkness, Cassie felt both relief and dread relief that the immediate confrontation was over, dread at the certainty that it was merely postponed. "He'll be back," she said quietly. "I'm counting on it." Garrett's response surprised her with its confidence. "Better to face him here, on our terms, than to keep wondering when and where he'll strike." A few minutes later, Jake's familiar knock sounded on the door. Garrett opened it to find his foreman's weathered face set in grim lines. "He's not happy," Jake reported without preamble. "Demanded to search the premises, claimed he had legal authority to recover stolen property. I told him he could come back with a sheriff and proper papers, or he could leave now and save himself the embarrassment." "How did he take that?" "About as well as you'd expect. Made some threats about what happens to people who interfere with his business, but ultimately decided discretion was the better part of valor. For now." Jake's eyes found Cassie, and she saw understanding in his expression, not judgment or fear, but the quiet acceptance of someone who'd chosen his side and would stand by it. "I'm sorry," she began, but Jake cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Nothing to apologize for. We've all seen his type before, men who think power gives them the right to treat others as property. This ranch has never backed down from bullies, and we're not starting now." The simple declaration of loyalty brought tears to Cassie's eyes. These people, who owed her nothing, were risking their safety and peace for principles that seemed increasingly rare in the world. "What's our next move?" Garrett asked. "I've got the hands taking shifts watching the approaches," Jake replied. "Tommy's riding to the Morrison place to warn them and ask for help if needed, and I sent word to Sheriff Harrison he should be here by morning. Think Harrison will help. He's an honest man, far as I know. If Dutch has legal papers, we'll deal with that through proper channels. If he doesn't, well," Jake's expression grew harder, "then we handle it the way we handle all trespassers who threaten what's ours." After Jake left, Garrett and Cassie remained in her small room, neither quite ready to separate despite the lateness of the hour. The confrontation had shifted something between them, creating an intimacy born of shared danger and mutual trust. "I keep thinking about what my father would do," Cassie said, fingering the cross beneath her shirt. "He always said that running from trouble just meant you'd face it later with less strength and fewer allies. Sounds like wise counsel. He also said that sometimes the hardest battles are worth fighting because of what victory means for other people. That standing up to evil isn't just about protecting yourself, it's about protecting everyone who comes after you." The observation carried weight beyond their immediate situation, and Garrett found himself admiring not just her courage, but the moral framework that guided her decisions, even in desperate circumstances. "Your father raised a remarkable daughter," he said quietly. "He raised me to believe that character matters more than circumstances, that how we respond to hardship reveals who we really are underneath all the surfaces we show the world." "And what do you think this situation reveals about who you really are?" Cassie considered the question seriously, looking back over the months of running and hiding, the fear and desperation that had driven her choices. "That I'm stronger than I thought," she said finally. "That I can endure more than I believed possible, and that I'm ready to stop being afraid and start being angry." The transformation in her voice, from uncertainty to determination, stirred something powerful in Garrett's chest. This was the woman her father had raised, not the frightened creature Dutch Kellerman had tried to create, but someone with the moral courage to stand against injustice regardless of personal cost. "Tomorrow changes everything," he said, recognizing the truth even as he spoke it. "Yes," she agreed. "Tomorrow we stop running and start fighting back." As they finally parted for the night, both of them understood that the sanctuary of Thorn Hollow Ranch had become something more, a battleground, where more than just Cassie's freedom would be decided. The outcome would determine whether good people could still stand against evil, whether justice could triumph over power, and whether two people who'd found each other in the midst of crisis could build something lasting from the ashes of what they'd lost. The unused engagement ring lay hidden in the bottom drawer of Garrett's desk, wrapped in faded blue velvet that had once held promise instead of regret. He hadn't looked at it in 3 years, But this morning, as dawn painted the ranch in shades of gold and amber, he found himself staring at the drawer as if it contained answers to questions he'd never learned to ask properly. Sarah Manning had been the banker's daughter from Denver, beautiful and refined in all the ways a successful rancher's wife was supposed to be. Their courtship had followed the prescribed patterns of respectable society-supervised visits, chaperoned rides, carefully orchestrated conversations about shared interests and compatible futures. He'd proposed on a crisp October evening, offering her the ring and a life of comfort on one of Colorado's most prosperous ranches. She'd said yes with the proper enthusiasm, planned their wedding with meticulous attention to social expectations, and then, 3 weeks before the ceremony, had quietly but firmly called everything off. "I don't love you, Garrett," she'd said with the kind honesty that cut deeper than any deception could have. "And you don't love Menno, really. We love the idea of each other, the safety of a suitable match, but that's not enough to build a marriage on." She'd been right, of course. What he'd felt for her had been affection, admiration, and a kind of grateful relief that someone of her caliber had accepted his proposal. But it hadn't been love, no, the kind that made a man willing to risk everything for a woman's happiness, not the kind that made empty rooms feel full when she entered them. Now, as he prepared to face whatever the day would bring, Garrett found himself thinking about the difference between what he'd felt for Sarah and what was growing in his chest whenever he looked at Cassie Rowe. The contrast was startling. Where his feelings for Sarah had been calm and predictable, his attachment to Cassie felt like standing too close to a lightning storm, electric and dangerous and utterly beyond his control. A soft knock interrupted his contemplation. "Come in." Maria entered carrying a breakfast tray, her expression showing the strain of a night spent worrying about threats to the sanctuary she'd helped create at Thorn Hollow. "Cassie's in the kitchen," she reported, setting the tray on his desk. "That girl didn't sleep much, but she's got more steel in her spine this morning than I've seen since she arrived. Whatever you two talked about last night, it did her good." "Sheriff Harrison arrived an hour ago. He's having coffee with Jake, asking questions about last night's visitor. Seems like a decent man, willing to listen." Garrett felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease. Sheriff Bob Harrison had a reputation for fairness and competence, qualities that were sometimes rare in frontier law enforcement. If anyone could help them navigate the legal complexities of Dutch Kellerman's claims, it would be Harrison. "And our visitor from last night? No sign of him since he left, but Tommy spotted smoke from a campfire about 3 miles north. Could be anyone, but probably isn't." Garrett finished her thought grimly. Dutch wasn't the type to give up and ride away. He was regrouping, planning his next approach. "Patron," Maria said, using the Spanish term that carried more weight than simple employer. "This woman, she's good for you. I see how you look at her, how you stand straighter when she's near. Don't let fear make you stupid about what's right in front of you." The blunt assessment caught him off guard. Maria had worked for the Thorne family long enough to speak her mind freely, but she rarely offered personal advice so directly. "It's complicated, Maria, her situation, the danger she's in." "Love is always complicated," she replied, with the certainty of someone who'd navigated her own share of romantic challenges. "But it's also simple. You protect what matters to you, you fight for what you want to keep, and you don't let other people's evil steal your chance at happiness." Before he could formulate a response, Maria was gone, leaving him with food he didn't want and thoughts he wasn't ready to examine too closely. The ring in his desk drawer seemed to pulse with the weight of past mistakes and future possibilities. The kitchen was warm with morning light and the familiar sounds of ranch life beginning another day. Cassie stood at the stove beside Maria, learning to make biscuits with the focused attention she brought to all new tasks. Her hair was braided back neatly, and she wore one of Maria's spare aprons over her work dress, looking for all the world like she belonged in this domestic scene. But Garrett could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes flicked toward the windows, with each sound from the yard. She was operating on 2 levels, maintaining the appearance of normalcy, while remaining constantly alert for signs of danger. "Morning," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. She turned with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Sheriff Harrison seems like a good man. He's been asking thoughtful questions, not just going through the motions. That's encouraging. Garrett poured himself coffee from the pot that always seemed to be ready in Maria's kitchen. What's your impression of our situation? Honestly, I think Dutch overplayed his hand by coming here with threats instead of proper legal documents. The sheriff asked some pointed questions about jurisdiction and evidence that Dutch won't be able to answer satisfactorily. Sheriff Harrison chose that moment to enter the kitchen, a man in his 50s with grey hair and the kind of steady presence that came from years of dealing with difficult situations without losing his humanity. "Mr. Thorne," he said, extending a weathered hand, "I understand you've got some trouble brewing." "Sheriff." Garrett's handshake was firm, respectful. "Appreciate you coming out so quickly. Jake filled me in on the basics, but I'd like to hear the full story from Miss Rowe herself, if she's willing." Cassie nodded, setting down the wooden spoon she'd been using to mix biscuit dough. Over the next 20 minutes, she told her story with the same quiet dignity she'd shown Garrett, presenting facts without embellishment or self-pity. Harrison listened without interruption, his experienced eyes noting details that spoke to credibility, the consistency of her account, the specificity of her memories, the way her anger focused on injustice rather than personal grievance. "These gambling debts Mr. Kellerman claims your father owed?" Harrison said when she finished. "Did he show you any documentation? Promissory notes, witness statements, anything in writing?" "He had papers, but he wouldn't let me examine them closely. Said they were legal documents and that was all I needed to know." "And the men who supposedly witnessed these card games?" "All employees of Dutch's outfit, men who would say whatever he wanted them to say to keep their jobs." Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "In my experience, legitimate debts come with legitimate documentation. If this Kellerman fellow had solid legal ground to stand on, he'd have come here with properly executed papers and a territorial marshal, not threats and intimidation." "So what are our options?" Garrett asked. "Well, first thing is to establish that Miss Rowe is under the protection of the law here in Colorado. If Kellerman wants to pursue any legal claims, he'll have to do it through proper channels, which means providing actual evidence, not just allegations. And if he's not interested in proper channels," Harrison's expression grew harder, "then he'll discover that Colorado takes a dim view of men who try to settle disputes through threats and violence. I've got deputy marshals who can be here within a day if needed." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats in the yard, not the threatening approach of the previous night, but the familiar rhythm of ranch business. Tommy Santos appeared in the doorway, his young face flushed with urgency. "Boss, you need to see this," he said, holding out a piece of paper that looked like it had been nailed to something. "Found it on the gatepost this morning." Garrett took the paper, his expression darkening as he read. The message was brief and to the point. "The woman belongs to me. Interfering with my legal rights will have consequences. You have until sunset tomorrow to turn her over, or I'll take what's mine by force." "Well," Sheriff Harrison said after reading the note, "that simplifies things considerably. Threatening violence to obtain what he claims as property isn't legal anywhere in the territory. This gives me grounds to arrest him if he shows his face again." "You think he'll back down now that law enforcement is involved?" Cassie asked. Harrison studied her face, seeing intelligence and a hard-earned understanding of how the world really worked. "Honestly, probably not. Men like Kellerman don't usually back down, they escalate. But now we're on solid legal ground, and that makes all the difference. What do you recommend?" "I'm going to ride back to town and send word to the territorial marshal's office. They need to know we've got a situation that might require federal intervention. In the meantime, Mr. Thorne, I suggest you keep your people close and your weapons closer." After the sheriff left, the ranch settled into the tense quiet that comes before storms. The regular work continued. Cattle needed tending, horses required care, equipment demanded maintenance, but everything was conducted with heightened awareness. Cassie threw herself into the day's tasks with fierce determination, as if staying busy could hold back the fear that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. She worked alongside Tommy in the horse paddock, her gentle competence with the animals providing a strange counterpoint to the violence that loomed on the horizon. "You're good with them," Tommy observed as she calmed a skittish mare with nothing more than patience and soft words. "Animals know when you're afraid," she replied, stroking the mare's neck with steady hands. "If you can control your fear, you can help them control theirs." "Is that how you've survived, controlling your fear?" The question was more perceptive than she'd expected from someone so young, and she considered her answer carefully. "Partly," she said finally, "but mostly by remembering that fear is just an emotion, doesn't have to control your actions. You can be afraid and still choose to do what's right." "And what's right in this situation?" "Standing up to bullies," she said with quiet conviction. "Refusing to let evil people win just because fighting back is dangerous." As the afternoon wore on, Garrett found himself watching Cassie with growing admiration and something deeper, a recognition that this woman possessed the kind of strength that complemented rather than competed with his own. Where Sarah had needed protection from the harsh realities of ranch life, Cassie faced them head-on with courage and competence. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was falling in love with her, had perhaps already fallen, and the knowledge terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. That evening, as the ranch settled into the careful vigilance that would mark their nights until the crisis passed, Garrett made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. The ring in his desk drawer represented one kind of future safe, predictable, built on compatibility rather than passion. But Cassie Rowe represented something entirely different, a love worth fighting for, a future worth risking everything to protect, and the kind of partnership that could weather any storm if both people were willing to stand together against whatever threatened them. The only question was whether they would survive the coming confrontation long enough to explore what they might build together. The brass sheriff's badge lay tarnished and bent on Sheriff Harrison's desk, a piece of evidence that told a story of corruption and violence stretching far beyond Cassie Rowe's personal tragedy. Harrison turned it over in his weathered hands, studying the scratches and dents that spoke of its violent removal from the chest of Sheriff Marcus Cole, the lawman who'd tried to investigate Dutch Kellerman's activities in Texas. "Found it in Cole's personal effects," Harrison explained to Garrett and Cassie as they sat in his office the following morning. "The man who sent it said Cole was asking questions about fraudulent land claims and mysterious deaths right before he had his own accident." Cassie felt ice form in her stomach. Dutch killed a sheriff? Can't prove it directly, but the pattern's pretty clear. Sheriff Cole was looking into irregularities in several land transfers around Amarillo cases, where small ranchers died in suspicious accidents and their properties ended up in the hands of men like Kellerman. "How many cases?" Garrett asked. "At least 6 that we know of. All involving men who owned valuable grazing land, all dying in ways that could be explained as accidents, all leaving behind debts that conveniently transferred their property to Dutch Kellerman or his associates." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. What Cassie had experienced wasn't an isolated case of one evil man's obsession. It was part of a systematic campaign of murder and theft that had been operating for years. "My father," she whispered, the pieces finally falling into place. "He wasn't the first." "Probably not," Harrison confirmed grimly. "And if we don't stop Kellerman here, he won't be the last." The revelation changed everything. This was no longer just about protecting Cassie from an abusive pursuer. It was about stopping a criminal enterprise that had already claimed multiple lives and would claim more if left unchecked. "What do you need from us?" Garrett asked. "Kellerman's gotten away with this because he operates in remote areas where law enforcement is sparse and victims are isolated. But here we've got witnesses, documentation, and the resources to fight back properly." Harrison stood and moved to a wall map marked with pins and notations. "I've been in contact with territorial authorities in Texas, Kansas, and New Mexico. Kellerman's activities have left traces across 3 territories, but no one's had enough evidence to build a solid case." "Until now," Cassie said, understanding beginning to dawn. "Until now. You're the first potential victim who escaped before he could silence you permanently. Your testimony, combined with what we're learning about his other activities, could finally bring him to justice. The weight of responsibility settled on Cassie's shoulders like a lead blanket. It was one thing to run for her own life. It was another to carry the hopes of justice for all of Dutch's victims. "What if I'm not strong enough?" she asked quietly. "What if I break under the pressure?" "You won't," Garrett said with absolute certainty. "You've already proven you're stronger than anything he can throw at you." Harrison nodded agreement. "Miss Rowe, I've been in law enforcement for 23 years, and I've learned to recognize courage when I see it. You've got the kind of strength that comes from surviving the worst and still caring about what happens to others. But what's our immediate situation? He's given us until sunset to turn me over. He's made a strategic error." Harrison replied with satisfaction. "By putting his threats in writing and setting a deadline, he's forced us into a confrontation on our terms, with legal authority clearly on our side. You think he'll actually try something?" "I think he's desperate enough to try anything. Men like Kellerman don't give up on what they consider their property, and he's invested too much in this pursuit to walk away empty-handed." As if summoned by their conversation, Jake Morrison appeared in the office doorway, his expression grim. "Sheriff, Mr. Thorne, you've got company. 3 riders approaching the ranch under a white flag. But they're armed, and they don't look like they're here for friendly conversation." Harrison checked his pocket watch. 2 hours before sunset. He's coming early, probably hoping to catch us unprepared. "Are we prepared?" Cassie asked. "As ready as we're going to be," Garrett replied. Jake's got the hands positioned around the ranch buildings, Tommy's watching the back approaches, and Maria's got food and medical supplies ready in case this turns into a siege. The 3 of them mounted their horses and rode toward the ranch, where they could see Dutch Kellerman and his 2 companions waiting in the yard. Even at a distance, Dutch's posture radiated arrogance and barely contained violence. As they drew closer, Cassie got her first clear look at the man who'd haunted her dreams for months. Dutch Kellerman was bigger than she remembered, his bulk suggesting strength that had gone soft around the edges but remained dangerous. His face was weathered and hard, with small eyes that seemed to catalogue everything around him as potential threats or assets. His companions were clearly hired, musclemen with the lean, predatory look of those who made their living through violence. They sat their horses with the easy confidence of people who'd faced down their share of opposition and expected this encounter to follow familiar patterns. "Kellerman," Sheriff Harrison called out as they approached. "You're trespassing on private property." "Sheriff," Dutch replied with mock courtesy, "I'm here on legitimate business, exercising my legal rights to recover stolen property. The only thing stolen here is the lives of good people you've murdered for their land." Harrison shot back. "Sheriff Marcus Cole was a friend of mine, and I know what happened to him." For the first time, something flickered behind Dutch's cold-eye surprise, perhaps, that his past activities had come to light. "I don't know what you're talking about, Sheriff. I'm just here to collect what's mine and be on my way." "Miss Rowe doesn't belong to you or anyone else," Garrett said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who'd made his choice and would stand by it regardless of consequences. "Mr. Thorne, isn't it?" Dutch's attention shifted to Garrett with the focused intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "I hear you've been harboring my property, interfering with my legal rights. That's a serious mistake." "The only mistake here is yours," Garrett replied evenly, "coming onto my land with threats and intimidation." Dutch's facade of civility began to slip, revealing the brutal nature underneath. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, ranch boy. I've been collecting debts and settling accounts across 3 territories. You're just another obstacle to be removed." "Is that a threat?" Harrison asked, his hand moving closer to his sidearm. "It's a promise," Dutch replied. "I've got legal documents giving me authority to recover my property, and I've got the means to enforce that authority if necessary." "Let's see these legal documents," Harrison demanded. Dutch reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, but as Harrison moved to examine it, even a cursory glance revealed its inadequacy. "This is a bill of sale for livestock," Harrison said dismissively. It has nothing to do with Miss Rowe or any supposed debt. There are other documents. No, there aren't, Cassie said, finding her voice and her courage in the same moment. There never were. You killed my father for his land, and when that didn't work out the way you planned, you decided to claim me as compensation. The accusation hung in the air like a gunshot, and Dutch's mask finally fell away completely, revealing the cold killer underneath. "Careful, girl," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "Accusations like that can be dangerous to your health." "Like asking questions was dangerous to Sheriff Cole's health," Harrison interjected. "Like improving rangeland was dangerous to Thomas Rowe's health." Dutch's companions shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward their weapons as the confrontation reached its breaking point. "This ends now, Kellerman," Harrison said with finality. "You and your men turn around and ride out of Colorado, and maybe you'll live long enough to stand trial for your crimes." "For what, Sheriff? You'll arrest me? You and what army?" As if, in answer to his question, ranch hands began appearing from their concealed positions around the yard. Jake Morrison with his rifle, Tommy Santos with a shotgun, 3 other men with weapons trained on the intruders. "This army," Garrett said quietly. "Good people who've decided they've had enough of men like you." For the first time since arriving, Dutch looked uncertain. He'd expected to face 1 man and 1 woman instead. He found himself outnumbered by people who clearly knew how to handle weapons and weren't intimidated by his reputation. "This isn't over," he said finally, jerking his horse's reins with unnecessary violence. "Yes, it is," Cassie said, stepping forward with a courage that surprised even herself. "I'm not running anymore, Dutch. I'm staying right here, and I'm going to tell everyone who'll listen about what you really are." "You little—" "Enough," Harrison commanded. "You've got 10 seconds to get off this property, or I'm placing you under arrest for trespassing, making terroristic threats, and conspiracy to commit murder." Dutch stared at Cassie for a long moment, hatred burning in his eyes like a live coal. But faced with overwhelming opposition and no legal ground to stand on, he finally spurred his horse toward the gate. "This isn't finished," he called back. "You can't watch her forever." But as the 3 riders disappeared into the gathering dusk, everyone present understood that something fundamental had shifted. The confrontation they'd all been dreading was over, but the war itself was just beginning. That evening, as the ranch settled into cautious celebration of their temporary victory, Garrett found Cassie sitting on the porch of the main house, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. "How are you feeling?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "Different," she said after a moment's consideration. "For months, I've been afraid of him, of what he represented, but today, when I looked into his eyes, I realized something." "What's that?" "He's just a man. A terrible, evil man, but still just a man, and men can be stopped." Garrett studied her profile in the starlight, seeing strength where before there had been only fear, determination where before there had been only desperation. "What happens now? Now we finish what we started," she said with quiet conviction. "Sheriff Harrison needs my testimony to build his case, and I'm going to give it to him. All of it, everything I know about Dutch's operation. That could take weeks, maybe months. Then I guess I'll be staying in Colorado for a while longer." She turned to look at him directly. "If that's all right with you." The question carried weight beyond its surface meaning, and Garrett felt his heart skip as he recognized the invitation implicit in her words. "Cassie," he said carefully, "there's something I need to tell you. Something about how I feel." "I know," she interrupted gently. "I can see it in your eyes, in the way you've risked everything to protect me. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" The brass badge in Sheriff Harrison's office represented justice delayed but not denied. Here, under the Colorado stars, with a woman who'd found her courage in the face of impossible odds, Garrett began to believe that some stories could have happy endings after all. The forged ownership papers lay scattered across Sheriff Harrison's desk like fallen leaves, their careful script and official-looking seals unable to disguise the fundamental deception they represented. But it was what the papers revealed about the scope of Dutch Kellerman's criminal enterprise that left the three people studying them stunned into silence. "This isn't just about land fraud," Harrison said, his voice heavy with the weight of revelation. "This is about the entire territorial expansion. Look at these property descriptions." Cassie leaned forward, studying the documents that Dutch had been carrying when they'd searched his belongings after arresting him for the attack on the ranch 2 nights earlier. What she'd initially assumed were simple forged deeds for her father's small spread turned out to be something far more sinister. "These properties," she began, then stopped as the implications hit her. "Every major water source between Denver and Santa Fe," Garrett finished grimly. "If someone controlled all these parcels, they'd control the entire cattle industry in 3 territories. The papers detailed a conspiracy that went far beyond Dutch Kellerman's personal greed. They revealed a systematic plan to control the most valuable rangeland in the American Southwest through a combination of murder, fraud, and territorial corruption that reached into the highest levels of government." "Look at these signatures," Harrison said, pointing to a series of documents bearing official territorial seals. "Judge William Crawford, Territorial Commissioner James Mitchell, Land Office Director Robert Haysall, legitimate officials, all signing off on property transfers that we now know were based on fraudulent claims." "Are they part of the conspiracy?" Cassie asked. "That's the question, isn't it?" Harrison replied. "Either they're complicit in the largest land fraud scheme in territorial history, or they're being systematically deceived by forged documents that are far more sophisticated than anything Dutch Kellerman could have produced on his own." Garrett studied the papers with the careful attention of someone who'd grown up understanding land law and property rights. "The quality of these forgeries is extraordinary. The paper, the ink, the official seals someone with access to legitimate government resources created these. Which means Dutch isn't the mastermind," Cassie said, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "He's just the muscle, the man who handles the dirty work, while someone else pulls the strings." The revelation reframed everything they thought they knew about their situation. Dutch Kellerman wasn't a rogue operator pursuing his own twisted obsession. She was part of an organized criminal conspiracy that had infiltrated the territorial government itself. "There's something else," Harrison said, pulling out a leather-bound ledger that had been hidden in Dutch's saddlebags. "This contains records of payments, names, location sits, a complete accounting of the conspiracy's operations." Cassie felt her blood run cold as she recognized some of the names in the ledger. "That's Samuel Morrison, the banker in Amarillo. And there's Judge Peterson, the man who refused to hear my appeal about my father's supposed debts." "How many people are involved in this?" Garrett asked. Harrison flipped through pages of meticulous records, each entry representing another piece of the massive conspiracy. "At least 30 people that we can identify from these records, spread across 3 territories and including some of the most powerful men in the region. And they're all working together to steal the most valuable land in the territories," Cassie finished, understanding flooding through her with sickening clarity. "Not just steal it," Garrett said, studying a map that had been folded among the papers. "Control it. Look at this. It's a railroad survey map showing proposed routes for the Denver and Rio Grande expansion." The map revealed the true scope of the conspiracy's ambitions. Every property targeted for acquisition lay along the planned railroad routes, land that would become exponentially more valuable once the rails were laid. The conspirators weren't just stealing individual ranches, they were positioning themselves to control the economic development of the entire region. "My father's land," Cassie whispered, finding the familiar boundaries marked in red ink on the map. It wasn't about the grazing rights at all. The railroad survey shows a proposed depot location right in the middle of his property, which would have made it worth a fortune instead of the modest value of a small cattle operation. Harrison said grimly, "Your father was killed because he owned the single most strategic piece of land for the railroad's expansion plans." The casual brutality of it took Cassie's breath away. Her father had died not because of gambling debts or personal animosity, but because he'd stood in the way of vast corporate profits. He'd been murdered for the crime of owning something valuable without realizing its true worth. But there's more, Harrison continued, turning to a section of the ledger marked with different colored ink. These entries show payments to territorial officials, judges, land office clerks, a complete network of corruption designed to legitimize the fraudulent transfers. How much money are we talking about? Garrett asked. Conservative estimate? Several $1 million in current land values, but potentially tens of millions once the railroad comes through. This isn't just criminal, it's treason against the territorial government. The magnitude of the conspiracy was staggering. What had begun as Cassie's personal fight for survival had revealed a criminal enterprise that threatened the entire foundation of law and order in the territories. Dutch mentioned a boss, Cassie said suddenly, remembering fragments of conversations she'd overheard during her captivity. Someone he reported to, someone who gave him his orders. Any idea who? He never used names, but he was afraid of whoever it was. Dutch Kellerman isn't afraid of much, but when he talked about his boss, there was real fear in his voice. Harrison turned back to the ledger, studying the payment records with renewed focus. Most of these payments are initialed rather than signed, but there's a pattern. Look, the largest payments all bear the same set of initials, R.H.M. Robert Hayes Mitchell, Garrett suggested. The Land Office Director and Territorial Commissioner? That would make sense, Harrison said. Someone in his position would have access to all the official documents needed for this kind of fraud, plus the authority to approve property transfers without extensive oversight. But it's also someone with enough political connections to corrupt judges and local officials, Cassie pointed out. Dutch always acted like his boss was untouchable, someone with power that reached into the highest levels of government. The implications were chilling. If their suspicions were correct, the conspiracy included one of the most powerful political figures in the territory, someone with the authority to make their evidence disappear and their accusations meaningless. What do we do with this information? Garrett asked. If RHM is really Robert Hayes Mitchell, how do we fight someone with that kind of power? Carefully, Harrison replied, and with absolute proof. Accusations against a territorial commissioner require evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away. Which we have, Cassie said, gesturing toward the papers and ledger. Dutch's records, the forged documents, the pattern of fraudulent transfers, it's all here. It's here, but is it enough? Harrison's question carried the weight of years spent navigating territorial politics and jurisdictional complexities. Mitchell has friends in Washington, connections that reach into the federal government. If we move against him without overwhelming evidence, he'll crush us and bury this conspiracy so deep it'll never see daylight again. Then we get overwhelming evidence, Garrett said with quiet determination. We follow every lead in that ledger, track down every forged document, and build a case so solid that even Mitchell's political connections can't save him. That could take months, Harrison warned, and every day we delay gives them time to cover their tracks, eliminate witnesses, destroy evidence. What about Dutch? Cassie asked. He's facing murder charges now. Maybe we can convince him to testify against his boss in exchange for a reduced sentence. Men like Dutch don't usually break, Harrison said. He knows that testifying against the conspiracy would be signing his own death warrant. Better to face a hangman's noose than the kind of death his former associates would arrange. But he might talk if he thought it was his only chance at survival, Garrett suggested. If we could convince him that we're going to bring down the whole conspiracy with or without his help, he might decide cooperation is his best option. Harrison considered the possibility. It's worth trying. Dutch has been in custody for 2 days now, and isolation has a way of making even hardened criminals reconsider their loyalties. There's something else, Cassie said, remembering a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time. When Dutch first approached me about the supposed debt, he mentioned that my father had been asking questions about property values in the area. He said it was suspicious that a small rancher would be interested in land speculation. But your father wasn't speculating, Garrett said, understanding immediately. He was trying to understand why his property had suddenly become so valuable. Exactly. Someone must have approached him about selling, maybe offered him far more than the land should have been worth for cattle grazing. When he started investigating, he discovered something that made him dangerous to the conspiracy. The picture was becoming clearer and more tragic. With each revelation, Thomas Rowe hadn't been killed simply because he owned valuable land. He'd been murdered because he'd begun to uncover the conspiracy that sought to steal it. "Your father was a threat because he was honest," Harrison said quietly. "In a conspiracy built on fraud and corruption, an honest man asking the right questions becomes the most dangerous enemy of all." Which means others like him are still out there, Cassie realized. Other small ranchers who own strategic properties, who might be asking similar questions. "And who might become the conspiracy's next targets," Garrett added grimly. The weight of responsibility settled on all three of them like a physical presence. They weren't just fighting for justice for past crimes, they were racing to prevent future murders, to save the lives of people who didn't even know they were in danger. "We need to warn them," Cassie said. "Every property owner along that railroad route, every rancher whose land appears on that map, they have a right to know what they're facing." "And we need to do it quickly," Harrison agreed, "before Mitchell realizes that Dutch has been captured and his records compromised. Once word gets out that we have this evidence, the conspiracy will go into damage control mode, which means eliminating anyone who might pose a threat." As they studied the forged ownership papers one more time, each document representing lives destroyed and futures stolen, Cassie felt a strange sense of destiny settling around her. Her father's death, her months of running, her arrival at Thorn Hollow Ranchit had all led to this moment, to the discovery that could bring down a conspiracy that had corrupted the very foundations of territorial law. "My father used to say that sometimes the worst things that happen to us turn out to be preparation for the most important things we'll ever do," she said quietly. "I think I'm beginning to understand what he meant." Outside Sheriff Harrison's office, the Colorado sky was beginning to darken with the promise of storm clouds gathering on the horizon. But inside, three people who had stumbled onto the truth were preparing to fight the most important battle of their lives, not just for their own survival, but for the very soul of the territories they called home. Garrett's father's rifle lay across his lap like a sleeping predator, its walnut stock worn smooth by 3 generations of Thorn hands. The Winchester had belonged to his grandfather first, carried through the Indian Wars and the early days of territorial settlement. His father had used it to defend the ranch during the bitter winter of '78, when desperate men had tried to take by force what they couldn't acquire through honest means. Now it fell to Garrett to continue that legacy of protection, to stand against those who would destroy what good people had built. The rifle represented more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of the responsibility that came with owning something worth defending, the obligation to protect not just property, but principles, not just land, but the law itself. Dawn was still 2 hours away, but sleep had become impossible. The past week had transformed Thorn Hollow from a peaceful cattle ranch into the center of a territorial crisis that threatened to destroy everything Garrett had inherited from his father and grandfather. Dutch Kellerman sat in the county jail, his records and documents providing damning evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. But his arrest had set in motion forces that were now converging on the ranch with deadly intent. Sheriff Harrison had ridden in just after midnight with news that chilled the blood. Robert Hayes Mitchell, the territorial commissioner whose initials appeared throughout Dutch's ledger, had mobilized a force of federal marshals and territorial militia under the pretense of investigating reports of armed insurrection in the Bridle's End area. "He's calling you and Miss Rowe dangerous criminals," Harrison had explained, his weathered face grim with the implications. "Claims you're part of a conspiracy to defraud the territorial government, that you've been harboring known fugitives and interfering with federal law enforcement." The audacity of it was breathtaking. Mitchell was using his official authority to brand them as criminals while positioning himself as the lawman, restoring order to a lawless region. It was a masterful manipulation of the legal system, turning their evidence of his corruption into proof of their own guilt. "How many men is he bringing?" Garrett had asked. 20 federal marshals, 30 territorial militia, plus whatever local support he can muster along the way. More than enough to overwhelm any resistance we might offer. And our legal options? Limited. Mitchell has legal authority to investigate federal crimes, and he's framed this as exactly that kind of investigation. Any resistance we offer will be painted as further evidence of our guilt. Now, as Garrett sat in the pre-dawn darkness, checking his father's rifle for the 100th time, he wrestled with impossible choices. Fighting back would confirm Mitchell's claims and provide justification for whatever violence followed. But surrendering would almost certainly mean the death of everyone who knew the truth about the conspiracy, executed as dangerous criminals or murdered while attempting to escape. A soft footstep on the porch announced Cassie's approach. She moved through the darkness with the careful stealth of someone who'd learned to avoid drawing attention, but Garrett's heightened senses caught the familiar pattern of her movement. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. "Too much to think about." He gestured toward the horizon where the first faint lightning suggested dawn's approach. "In a few hours, this place is going to be crawling with federal marshals and territorial militia, all convinced that we're dangerous criminals who need to be stopped at any cost. And what's our plan?" "That's what I've been trying to figure out." Garrett's voice carried the strain of a man facing decisions that could determine not just his own fate, but the survival of everyone he cared about. "If we fight, we prove Mitchell's claims about us being dangerous. If we surrender, we disappear into the territorial justice system and never get a chance to expose the real conspiracy." Cassie was quiet for a moment, studying the rifle in his hands. "Your father carried that?" "And his father before him. 3 generations of Thorns have used this rifle to protect what's ours." He ran his hand along the worn stock, feeling the connection to the men who'd faced their own impossible choices in defense of what they believed in. "I keep thinking about what they would do in this situation. What conclusions have you reached?" "That sometimes the right choice isn't about winning or losing. It's about making sure the truth survives, even if we don't." The stark assessment hung in the air between them, and Cassie felt the weight of everything they'd discovered pressing down like a physical force. The evidence they'd gathered could bring down a conspiracy that had corrupted the territorial government and murdered innocent people, but only if it survived the coming confrontation. "We need to get the evidence to someone beyond Mitchell's reach," she said, "someone with the authority and integrity to act on what we've learned." "Who?" "Mitchell has connections throughout the territorial government, and his version of events is already spreading. Anyone we approach will have heard that we're dangerous criminals before they hear our side of the story. Then we go higher. Federal authorities in Washington, newspaper editors in Denver, territorial governors in other regions. Someone, somewhere, has to be beyond Mitchell's influence." Garrett considered the possibilities, his mind racing through potential allies and escape routes. Jake's already hidden copies of Dutch's records in 3 different locations. Even if they destroy the originals, the evidence will survive. "That's something." Cassie's voice carried a mixture of hope and determination. "As long as the truth exists somewhere, there's a chance it will eventually come to light." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Both of them tensed, expecting the worst, but the rhythm was familiar, Jake Morrison returning from his scouting mission to observe Mitchell's approach. "They're about 5 miles out," Jake reported as he swung down from his lathered horse. "Moving slow and careful, like they expect trouble. Mitchell's riding with them, wearing a federal marshal's badge and acting like he's leading a righteous crusade." "How much time do we have?" "Maybe an hour before they reach the main gate. But boss, there's something else you need to know." Jake's expression grew even more grim. "I recognize some of the men riding with Mitchell. They're not federal marshals or territorial militia. They're the same kind of hired guns Dutch Kellerman used to employ." The revelation confirmed Garrett's worst fears. This wasn't a legitimate law enforcement operation. It was a private army disguised as federal authority, sent to eliminate everyone who knew the truth about the conspiracy. "How many of our people are willing to stand and fight?" Garrett asked. "All of them," Jake replied without hesitation. "Tommy, Maria, the other hands, they all know what this is really about, and they're not backing down. This ranch has been good to them, and they're prepared to defend it." The loyalty of his people warmed Garrett's heart, even as it broke it. These were good men and women who deserved better than to die for the crimes of corrupt officials and greedy conspirators. "I won't ask them to sacrifice their lives for my fight," he said. "With respect, boss, this isn't your fight anymore," Jake replied. "This is about whether decent people can stand up to corruption without being destroyed for it. That's everyone's fight." As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, the ranch came alive with the quiet activity of people preparing for what might be their last stand. Weapons were checked and loaded, positions were assigned, and final preparations were made for a confrontation that would determine not just their own fate, but the future of law and justice in the territories. Maria emerged from the kitchen carrying a pot of coffee and a grim expression that spoke of someone who'd made peace with whatever the day might bring. "I've prepared food and medical supplies," she reported. "Whatever happens, we'll face it with full stomachs and clear consciences." "Maria," Cassie began, "you don't have to." "Mija," the older woman interrupted gently, "I've lived long enough to know the difference between right and wrong. These men who come with lies and corruption, they represent everything I've spent my life standing against. I stay." Similar conversations were taking place throughout the ranch, as each person made their choice about whether to flee or fight. In the end, not one of them chose to run. They would stand together, whatever the cost. As the sun crested the horizon, painting the ranch in shades of gold and amber that might be the last beautiful sunrise they would ever see, Garrett felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The rifle in his hands connected him to generations of men who'd faced similar choices to stand for what was right, even when standing meant dying. "Whatever happens today," he said to Cassie, as they watched Mitchell's force approach in the distance, "I want you to know that meeting you, fighting beside you, has been the greatest honor of my life." "The honor has been mine," she replied, her hand finding his and holding tight. "My father always said that how we face our hardest moments defines who we really are. I'm proud to face this moment with you." The approaching riders were visible now, a dark line against the morning sky that represented more than just personal danger. They represented the choice between law and lawlessness, between justice and corruption, between the America that could be and the America that powerful men were trying to create through violence and fraud. Garrett raised his father's rifle, feeling the weight of history and responsibility in his hands. The choice had been made. Now all that remained was to see it through to whatever end awaited them. In the distance, thunder rumbled not from approaching storms, but from the hoofbeats of men who carried badges they'd never earned in service of laws they'd already broken. The final confrontation was about to begin, and with it, the test of whether truth and courage could triumph over power and corruption in the American territories of 1884. The burning barn cast dancing shadows across the ranch yard as Garrett pressed himself against the water trough, Dutch's bullets chewing splinters from the wood above his head. The structure his grandfather had built with his own hands 40 years earlier was being consumed by flames that Mitchell's men had set to flush out the defenders, and the sight of it filled Garrett with a rage that burned hotter than the fire itself. "Cassie," he called out, trying to locate her position in the chaos of gunfire and smoke that had transformed his peaceful ranch into a battlefield. "Here." Her voice came from behind the overturned wagon where she'd taken cover with Tommy Santos, both of them firing carefully aimed shots at the federal marshals who were advancing under the cover of Mitchell's authority and false righteousness. The attack had begun at dawn, exactly as they'd expected, but the reality of it was more brutal than any of them had anticipated. Mitchell had ridden up to the main gate under a flag of truce, demanding their surrender for crimes against the territorial government. When Garrett had responded by presenting Dutch's ledger and demanding that Mitchell explain his initials throughout the criminal records, the corrupt commissioner had simply smiled and given the order to attack. "Take no prisoners," he'd commanded his hired guns disguised as lawmen. "These people are dangerous criminals who've forfeited their right to due process." The first volley had shattered the morning peace, and now the ranch was engulfed in a battle that would determine not just their survival, but the future of justice in the territories. Jake Morrison lay behind a pile of feed sacks, his rifle speaking with deadly accuracy as he picked off the attackers who tried to advance on the main house. His weathered face was set in lines of grim determination, and blood from a graze on his temple mixed with the sweat and smoke that covered his features. "Boss," he called out during a brief lull in the firing, "they're trying to flank us through the horse paddock. If they get behind us, we're finished." Garrett could see the tactical situation deteriorating with each passing minute. Mitchell had brought superior numbers and firepower, and despite the defenders' intimate knowledge of the ranch layout, they were slowly being overwhelmed by sheer force. "Tommy!" Garrett shouted. "Take Maria and get to the root cellar. If we can't hold them, someone needs to survive to tell the truth." "I'm not leaving." Tommy's young voice cracked with emotion and determination. "This is my home too." The boy's courage was inspiring and heartbreaking in equal measure. At 17, he should have been worrying about courting girls and learning his trade, not fighting for his life against corrupt federal marshals who'd perverted everything law enforcement was supposed to represent. A new voice cut through the gunfire, Mitchell himself, amplified by a speaking trumpet as he attempted to end the resistance through psychological pressure. "Garrett Thorne, you're surrounded and outnumbered. Surrender now, and I guarantee you'll receive fair treatment under territorial law." The promise was as empty as the man who made it, and Garrett's response was to put a bullet through the wooden post Mitchell was using for cover, close enough to make the commissioner flinch. "Your guarantee isn't worth the breath you wasted making it," Garrett called back. "We've seen your idea of territorial law." The exchange seemed to enrage Mitchell, and his next commands to his men carried a viciousness that revealed the true nature of the man behind the official facade. "Burn them out. I want this place reduced to ashes, and I want everyone in it dead. No witnesses, no survivors, no evidence." The order confirmed what they'd all suspected. This wasn't about arresting criminals or enforcing the law. It was about eliminating everyone who could expose the conspiracy that had corrupted the territorial government. More buildings began to burn as Mitchell's men spread the flames with systematic efficiency. The tool shed, the chicken coop, and now the stable where Cassie had spent her first days learning to trust again all were being consumed by fire that served as both weapon and symbol of the destruction that corruption brought to everything it touched. "We can't stay here much longer," Jake warned as the heat from the burning buildings began to make their positions untenable. "The smoke's getting too thick, and they're using the fires to cover their advance." Cassie emerged from behind the wagon, her face streaked with soot and her eyes burning with determination that matched the flames surrounding them. In her hands, she carried not just a rifle, but Dutch's leather satchel bag that contained the evidence that could still bring down Mitchell's conspiracy if it survived the battle. "The evidence," she called to Garrett. "We have to get it to safety." "Where?" The question was practical and desperate. Every building on the ranch was either burning or under fire, and escape routes were being systematically cut off by Mitchell's tactical deployment of his forces. "The old mine shaft," Tommy suggested, referring to an abandoned silver mine on the edge of the property that had been worked out decades earlier. "It's deep enough to protect anything we hide there, and they might not even know it exists." The idea had merit, but reaching the mine would require crossing open ground under heavy fire from attackers who were advancing from multiple directions. "I'll go," Cassie said, clutching the satchel against her chest. "I'm smaller, faster, and if anyone deserves to risk their life for this evidence, it's me." "No," Garrett replied immediately. "If anyone's making that run, it's me. This is my ranch, my responsibility. And my father's murder we're trying to avenge," she shot back. "My testimony that will convict these criminals. My choice to make." The argument was interrupted by a new crisis zone of Mitchell's men had worked his way close enough to the main house to throw a flaming torch onto the roof, and the wooden shingles were beginning to catch fire. "The house!" Maria cried out from her position near the kitchen door, her voice carrying the anguish of someone watching a lifetime of memories being destroyed. The psychological impact was devastating. The main house represented more than just shelter. It was the heart of the ranch, the symbol of everything the Thorne family had built over 3 generations. Watching it burn was like watching their history being erased by men who cared nothing for the lives they were destroying. But the fire also presented an opportunity. As Mitchell's men focused on pressing their advantage, they momentarily relaxed their vigilance on the eastern approaches to the property. "Now," Garrett said, making his decision, "Cassie, take the evidence and run for the mine. We'll cover you." "Not without you," she replied fiercely. "We face this together, remember." Before Garrett could argue, the decision was made for them. A group of Mitchell's men had worked their way around the burning stable and were now advancing on their position with overwhelming firepower. The time for careful planning had passed now. It was about survival and protecting what mattered most. "Everyone fall back to the mine," Jake commanded, recognizing that their defensive positions were no longer tenable. Fighting retreat, covering each other. What followed was a desperate running battle across the ranch that had been Cassie's sanctuary and Garrett's inheritance. Buildings that had stood for decades were reduced to ash and rubble, livestock scattered in terror, and the peaceful life they'd all known was being systematically destroyed by men who served corruption instead of justice. As they fought their way toward the abandoned mine, Cassie pressed the satchel containing Dutch's evidence against her heart and thought about her father's words. "Sometimes the worst things that happen to us turn out to be preparation for the most important things we'll ever do." The burning barn behind them represented the destruction of everything they'd tried to protect, but perhaps from its ashes would rise something stronger, the truth that could bring down a conspiracy and restore justice to the territories. If they lived long enough to tell it. Dutch's confession letter lay spread across the table in Sheriff Harrison's office, the final piece of evidence that would ensure justice prevailed over corruption. The document, written in Dutch Kellerman's own hand during his final hours in custody, contained a complete account of Robert Hayes Mitchell's criminal conspiracy names, dates, locations, and methods that provided irrefutable proof of the systematic murder and fraud that had infected the territorial government. "He knew they were coming to kill him," Harrison explained to the assembled federal investigators who had arrived from Denver after word of the battle at Thorn Hollow Ranch had reached Washington. "Knew that Mitchell couldn't afford to let him live to testify, so he decided to get his confession on record before they silenced him permanently." U.S. Marshal Theodore Grant studied the document with the careful attention of someone who'd spent his career building cases against powerful criminals. A man in his 50s with grey hair and the kind of steady presence that came from years of dealing with corruption at the highest levels, Grant had arrived with a team of federal investigators after territorial officials in Washington had received alarming reports about irregularities in Colorado land transactions. "This is extraordinary," Grant said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the implications of what he was reading. "If Dutch Kellerman's account is accurate, Mitchell's conspiracy reaches into every level of territorial administration." "It's accurate," Cassie said quietly from her seat beside Garrett. Her clothes still bore the smoke stains from the battle that had destroyed Thorn Hollow Ranch 3 days earlier, and her face showed the strain of someone who'd watched everything she'd come to love reduced to ashes. "Every detail matches what I witnessed and what my father discovered before they killed him." The battle had ended with Mitchell's forces in full retreat after Jake Morrison had managed to reach the neighboring ranches and return with reinforcements who'd refused to believe the lies about Garrett and Cassie being dangerous criminals. Faced with overwhelming opposition from the local community, Mitchell had been forced to withdraw his hired guns and flee toward the territorial capital. But his flight had come too late. Dutch Kellerman's confession combined with the evidence from his personal records, had provided federal authorities with everything they needed to dismantle the entire conspiracy. "The scope of this operation is staggering," Grant continued, reading from Dutch's detailed account. 12 ranchers murdered, 47 fraudulent land transfers, corruption reaching into the territorial Supreme Court. This represents the largest criminal conspiracy in the history of the American territories. "What happens now?" Garrett asked. The question carried personal weight beyond its legal implications. His ranch lay in ruins, his cattle scattered, his family's legacy reduced to charred timbers and bitter memories. Justice might be served, but it wouldn't restore what had been destroyed. "Now we arrest everyone involved," Grant replied with grim satisfaction. Mitchell, his co-conspirators in the territorial government, the judges who legitimized fraudulent transfers, the land office clerks who processed forged documents, everyone who participated in this conspiracy will face federal charges. And the evidence will hold up in court? Between Dutch's confession, his personal records, and Miss Rowe's testimony about her father's murder, we have enough evidence to convict them all. This conspiracy is finished. The words should have brought satisfaction, but Cassie found herself feeling strangely empty. Justice for her father's murder was important, but it couldn't bring him back or undo the months of terror and loss she'd endured. The victory felt hollow when measured against the cost of achieving it. "There's something else," Grant continued, producing a document from his briefcase. "The federal government is prepared to make reparations for the damages caused by this conspiracy. Every rancher who lost property will be compensated, and the legitimate property owners will have their land restored." "Including Cassie's father's ranch?" Garrett asked. "Including Mr. Rowe's property. Miss Rowe is now the legal owner of one of the most valuable pieces of land in the territory, worth considerably more than what her father believed it was worth." The irony was bitter. Her father had been murdered for land that would have made them wealthy if they'd simply been allowed to live in peace. The railroad depot that the conspiracy had killed to control would now be built on property that belonged to his daughter. "I don't want it," Cassie said quietly. "That land is stained with my father's blood. I can't build a life on property that cost him his." Grant looked surprised. "Miss Rowe, you're talking about a considerable fortune. Once the railroad comes through, that property will be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars." "Money won't bring my father back," she replied, "and wealth built on murder isn't worth having." Garrett reached over and took her hand, understanding the moral conviction that drove her decision. "What will you do with it?" "Sell it," she said with growing certainty. "Use the money to help other families who've been victims of land fraud and corruption. Make sure my father's death counts for something more than just revenge." The decision revealed the strength of character that had attracted Garrett from the beginning, the refusal to profit from tragedy, the determination to transform suffering into service for others. "There's one more thing," Grant said, his expression growing more serious. "Dutch's confession mentions that Mitchell had contacts in Washington, federal officials who were aware of the conspiracy and chose to look the other way in exchange for political favors." "How high does it go?" Harrison asked. "We're still investigating, but it appears that certain senators and congressmen were aware of the irregularities in territorial land transactions and chose not to act. This scandal is going to reach into the highest levels of the federal government." The revelation was both encouraging and troubling. Encouraging because it meant the corruption would be thoroughly exposed and rooted out. Troubling because it suggested that the territorial governments had been systematically undermined by criminals operating with the knowledge and tacit approval of federal officials. "What about the ranchers who stood with us?" Garrett asked. "The men who rode to our aid when Mitchell was trying to destroy the ranch?" "Heroes, every one of them," Grant replied warmly. "Their willingness to stand up to federal authority, based on their knowledge of your character, was instrumental in exposing this conspiracy. They'll be commended for their courage." As the meeting concluded and the federal investigators prepared to continue their work, Cassie and Garrett found themselves standing outside the sheriff's office, looking toward the horizon where Thorn Hollow Ranch had once stood. Any regrets? Garrett asked. About which part? Any of it. Fighting back, risking everything, choosing to stand up to Mitchell instead of running. Cassie considered the question seriously, thinking about everything that had led them to this moment, her father's murder, her months of flight, her arrival at a ranch that had become both sanctuary and battleground. No regrets, she said finally. My father always said that courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about doing what's right even when you're terrified. We did what was right, even though it cost us everything. Did it? She turned to look at him directly, seeing strength tempered by loss but not broken by it. We lost buildings, land, possessions, but we saved lives, exposed corruption, and ensured that other families won't suffer what mine did. That seems like a fair trade. Garrett felt his heart swell with admiration for this woman who'd transformed personal tragedy into a force for justice, who'd refused to let evil triumph, even when the cost of resistance was everything she'd come to cherish. There's something I need to tell you, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that had been building for days. Something I should have said before the battle, in case we didn't survive it. What's that? I love you, Cassie Rowe. I love your courage, your strength, your refusal to compromise with evil. I love the way you gentle horses and the way you stand up to corrupt officials. I love everything about you, and I want to spend whatever life we have left building something worthy of what we've been through together. The declaration hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable, and carrying the weight of everything they'd experienced together. I love you too, she replied simply, and I can't think of anything I'd rather do than build a new life with you, starting from nothing but what we can create together. Dutch's confession letter would ensure that justice was served, that the conspiracy was dismantled, and that the territorial government was cleansed of the corruption that had infected it. But more importantly, it represented the triumph of truth over power, of courage over fear, of love over hatred. As they stood together in the fading light of day, surrounded by the ashes of what they'd lost, but strengthened by what they'd found in each other, Cassie and Garrett began to plan for a future that would be built not on inherited wealth or stolen land, but on the solid foundation of shared values and mutual respect. The confession letter had ended Mitchell's conspiracy, but it had also begun something newer, partnership between two people who'd learned that the most valuable things in life couldn't be destroyed by fire or stolen by corrupt officials, because they lived in the human heart and grew stronger when tested by adversity. Where do we start? Cassie asked, looking toward the horizon where their future waited to be written. With a simple question, Garrett replied, taking her hand in his. Will you marry me, Cassie Rowe? Will you help me build something that can't be burned down or stolen away? Yes, she said, the word carrying all the certainty of someone who'd found her place in the world. Yes, I'll marry you. And yes, we'll build something together that will honor everyone we've lost and everyone we've saved. The brass sheriff's badge that had started their investigation into Mitchell's conspiracy now lay in an evidence box in Denver, but its tarnished surface had reflected something more valuable than justice. It had reflected the possibility that good people, standing together, could still triumph over evil in a world that sometimes seemed designed to crush hope. As the sun set over Colorado, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, two people who'd lost everything began to dream of everything they might build together. The simple gold wedding band caught the morning light as Cassie turned it slowly on her finger, marveling at how something so small could represent such profound change. 6 months had passed since the battle that destroyed Thorn Hollow Ranch. 6 months since Dutch Kellerman's confession had brought down Robert Hayes Mitchell's criminal conspiracy. And 6 months since she'd agreed to marry the man who'd risked everything to protect her. The wedding had been a simple affair, held in the newly rebuilt church in Bridle's End, with the entire community in attendance. Sheriff Harrison had given her away, Maria Santos had prepared the wedding feast, and Jake Morrison had served as Garrett's best man. It was exactly the kind of ceremony her father would have wanted, focused on love and commitment rather than show and expense. Now, as she stood in the kitchen of their new home, watching the sun rise over land they'd purchased with money from the sale of her father's property, Cassie felt a peace she'd never imagined possible during those dark months of running and hiding. The house was smaller than the original Thorne family home, built with their own hands and those of friends who'd insisted on helping. Every board and shingle represented a choice to build something new rather than try to recreate what had been lost. The kitchen was Maria's design, efficient and welcoming, with windows that overlooked the horse paddock where thunder and honey grazed in peaceful contentment. "Good morning, Mrs. Thorne," Garrett said, appearing in the doorway with the quiet smile that never failed to warm her heart. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," she replied, moving into his arms with the ease of someone who'd found her true home. "How are the horses this morning?" "Restless. I think Thunder knows we're expecting company today." The company in question was U.S. Marshal Theodore Grant, who was making a final visit to update them on the prosecution of Mitchell's conspiracy. Over the past months, federal investigators had systematically dismantled the criminal network, arresting corrupt officials, recovering stolen property, and ensuring that victims received compensation for their losses. "Any word on Mitchell himself?" Cassie asked. Grant's telegram said he was finally located in Mexico, but died of fever before they could arrest him. Fitting end for a man who caused so much suffering. The news should have brought satisfaction, but Cassie found herself feeling only a weary relief that the threat was finally, definitively over. Mitchell's death meant that chapter of her life could be closed completely, allowing her to focus entirely on the future she and Garrett were building together. "I've been thinking about what we discussed," she said, settling into the chair beside him at their small kitchen table, "about the foundation we want to establish." The Thomas Rowe Foundation had been Cassie's idea, a way to transform the money from her father's property into something that could help other families facing land fraud and corruption. The foundation would provide legal assistance, investigate suspicious property transfers, and support law enforcement efforts to combat territorial crime. "I want to do more than just provide money," she continued. "I want to be actively involved, to use what I learned about Mitchell's operation to help other victims." "That could be dangerous," Garrett pointed out gently. "Going up against powerful criminals, testifying in court cases, putting yourself back in the kind of situations we just escaped from." "Everything worthwhile involves some risk," she replied, echoing lessons her father had taught her about courage and responsibility. "Besides, I won't be facing those dangers alone anymore." The truth of that statement filled both of them with quiet confidence. Together, they'd survived the worst that corruption and violence could throw at them. Together, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. A knock at the door announced Marshal Grant's arrival, and they welcomed him into their home with the hospitality that had become second nature during their months of building a new life. The final prosecutions concluded last week. Grant reported over coffee and Maria's incomparable biscuits. 14 territorial officials convicted, 47 fraudulent land transfers reversed, and over $200,000 in reparations paid to victims' families. And the federal officials who were involved? 3 senators and 2 congressmen have resigned in disgrace. They won't face criminal charges, but their political careers are finished. Grant's expression grew more serious. "There's something else. The territorial governor wants to meet with both of you." "What for?" Garrett asked. "To offer you positions in the new territorial administration. The corruption scandals have created a need for people with proven integrity to help rebuild public trust in territorial government." The offer was tempting and troubling in equal measure. Both Cassie and Garrett understood the importance of good people serving in government, but they'd also seen firsthand how power could corrupt even well-intentioned individuals. "We're honored by the offer," Cassie said carefully, "but we're not politicians. We're ranchers who got caught up in events beyond our control." "Which is exactly why you're the right people for these positions," Grant replied. "You've proven that you can't be bought, intimidated, or corrupted. In the current environment, those qualities are more valuable than political experience." They promised to consider the offer, but privately both knew their answer. Their calling lay not in the halls of government, but in the work of building a life that honored those they'd lost, while protecting those who might face similar threats. After Grant left, they walked together through the property they'd chosen for their new beginning. The land was different from the original Thorn Hollow, smaller, less grand, but theirs in a way that went beyond legal ownership. Every fence post had been set by their own hands, every decision about the layout had been made together, every improvement reflected their shared vision of what a home should be. "Do you ever miss it?" Cassie asked, looking toward the horizon where the original ranch had stood. "The house your grandfather built, the stables your father designed, all the history that went up in smoke." Garrett considered the question seriously, thinking about everything that had been lost and everything that had been gained in its place. "I miss the memories," he said finally. "The connection to my father and grandfather, the sense of continuing something they started. But I don't miss the burden of living up to other people's legacy instead of creating my own." "And what legacy do you want to create?" "One that you and I build together. One that's about more than just accumulating wealth or property, but about standing for something that matters." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders Jake Morrison and Tommy Santos, returning from their work on the far pastures with news of the day's activities. "Boss," Jake called out as he dismounted, "found sign of that mountain lion near the creek. Looks like he's been taking cattle from the Morrison place." "We'll track him tomorrow," Garrett replied. "Can't have him thinking our neighbor's livestock is his personal buffet." The easy exchange reminded Cassie of how much their lives had normalized in the months since the crisis. They still faced the ordinary challenges of ranch life predators, weather, market fluctuations, equipment failures. But these were problems that could be solved through hard work and cooperation rather than violence and corruption. That evening, as they sat on the porch of their new home watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky, Cassie felt the wooden cross her father had carved for her resting warm against her skin. The simple piece of pine had traveled with her through months of terror and uncertainty, and now it rested easy in a place of safety and love. "I think my father would be proud," she said quietly. "Of what?" "Of how his death led to something meaningful, of how many families will be spared, what we went through because of the foundation, of how love can grow in the ashes of tragedy." Garrett took her hand, feeling the strength in her fingers that had gentled his horses and steadied his courage during their darkest hours. "I know he would be," he said with absolute certainty, "just like I know he'd approve of the man you chose to marry." "How can you be so sure?" "Because you're your father's daughter, in all the ways that matter most. And any man who raised a woman with your character would recognize the same qualities in the man she chose to love." As they sat together in the peaceful darkness, surrounded by the sounds of horses settling for the night and cattle moving quietly through distant pastures, both of them understood that they'd found something rare and precious, a love that had been tested by the worst life could offer and had emerged stronger for the testing. The simple gold wedding band on Cassie's finger represented more than just their union. It represented the triumph of hope over despair, of love over hatred, of the future over the past. It was a symbol of the truth her father had taught her, that sometimes the worst things that happen to us turn out to be preparation for the most important things we'll ever do. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to stand for what was right, new chances to build something worthy of the sacrifices that had made their happiness possible. But tonight, under the Colorado stars that had witnessed their struggle and their triumph, it was enough to simply hold each other and marvel at the mysterious ways that Providence could transform endings into beginnings and sorrow into joy. The wedding band caught starlight as Cassie raised her hand to touch her husband's face, and in that simple gesture was contained all the promise of a future they would write together, one choice at a time, one day at a time, one act of courage at a time.